Without further ado, I introduce you to Dr. Deborah DiCroce.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think it still qualifies as afternoon. Wow, this is pretty impressive. And just think, in Chesapeake, my hometown, right here. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be a part of what I think truly is a historic moment, and my congratulations to the many individuals, to include my friend over here, Dan Bell, who's instrumental in pulling this thing forward. I'm going to take a little bit different approach in my remarks. I'm going to talk about how I've come to approach leadership over the past 25 plus years. And I want to begin with a story of efficiency experts and management consultants and Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. The story goes like this. It appears that there was a company chairman who'd been given tickets for a performance of Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. He couldn't go that evening, and he gave his tickets to his management consultant. The next morning, the chairman asked his management consultant how he'd enjoyed the performance, and instead of getting a few plausible observations, he was handed a memorandum which read, A, for considerable periods, the four oboe players had nothing to do. The numbers should be reduced and their work spread over the whole orchestra, thus eliminating peaks of activity. B, all the 12 violins were playing identical notes. This seems an unnecessary duplication, and the staff of this section should be drastically cut. If a large volume of sound is required, this could be obtained through an electrical amplifier. C, much effort was absorbed in the playing of semiquavers of eighth notes. This seems an excessive refinement, and it's recommended that all notes should be rounded up to the nearest semiquaver. If this were done, it should be possible to use trainees and lower grade operators. And finally, D, no useful purpose is served by repeating with horns the same passage that's already been handled by the strings. If all such redundant passages were eliminated, the concert could be reduced from 2 hours to 20 minutes. In fact, if Schubert had attended to these matters, he probably would have been able to finish the symphony after all. Okay, now you may be saying, what's that got to do with this TEDx and leadership? That's a good question. But I'm not going to supply the answer, at least not yet. So listen up as I speak instead in metaphor, if you will, and offer a case study on DiCroce and this leadership thing. Here's the case. We'll call it Act 1 of DiCroce as leader. And to take you back to the early 1990s, I was 37 years old and in my first community college presidency. In fact, I was barely in the second year of this presidency. The college was a pace-setter institution on many fronts with a quite strong national reputation among its peers. It was primarily state-supported, still is by the way, relying almost exclusively on state appropriation and tuition for its revenues. Back in the early 1990s, the college experienced a series of state budget reductions, or reversions as they called them back then, which resulted in one, a cumulative 15% decline in state funding, with the prospect of an eventual reality of reaching upwards of 26%, and two, an over 60% increase in in-state tuition, which eventually reached an almost 75% increase. To put this reality into perspective, even with a 70% tuition increase, this college had only recovered 80% of its loss in state appropriation. And before the budget was even touched, the good so-called good times, the college was operating with an inadequate budget base per state funding guidelines. So my point is, when the state budget reversions hit, and many of our four-year brethren, shall we say, caught cold, all of the community colleges in this particular state were on the verge of catching pneumonia. My institution back then initially responded to the cuts in the usual way that things were done back then. by tinkering with non-personal expenditures as much as possible. For example, we froze travel, we increased class size, we cut course offerings, we cut maintenance, we froze salary increases, we froze new hires, we closely monitored supplies. And in other words, anything that didn't move, we tried to freeze. And we far extended the bounds of budget flexibility, and in the process made an art out of crisis management for next week. In the wee hours one morning, in that late 1990, I was awakened by the realization, in the words of W.B. Yeats, that the center simply cannot hold. And that the hard reality was that we're going to have to seize the moment and restore balance to this budget, such as it was. I knew full well that such a move would surely result in program discontinuations and a reduction in force, two unprecedented actions in this college's then 20-year history. And going forward, my thoughts turned to not what, not if, but how. Okay, let's make sure that you've got the settings. State recession, major budget reductions, budget reduced to the marrow of the bone, budget out of balance, a presidential epiphany that the center can't hold, and a retrenchment plan in order, and Schubert's unfinished symphony playing melodically in the background. You got it? All right. To Act 2, the theoretical context of my leadership process. Now, I need to explain to you, I wasn't smart enough to have this context in mind way back then when I was 37 years old. All right, I didn't have it back then. This is more like Wordsworth's sense of poetry as being a spontaneous overflow of emotion recollected in tranquility. I figured this out later. Right? But the theoretical context is a work by Lee Bowman and Terry Deal called Reframing Organizations, Artistry, Choice, and Leadership. It goes all the way back to 1992 and is a staple in graduate school education in organizational theory and development. Bowman and Deal define leadership largely as situational, and they cast it in four frames: structural, human resource, political, and symbolic. What I've discovered in my own leadership journey, and leadership is a journey, but you all know that, right? That Bowman and Deal are correct. So let me outline the leadership process I used for development and implementation of this college's retrenchment plan back in the 90s within the context of these four frames, which I suppose brings us to Act 3 of DiCroce's leadership process. First frame, structural. Structural means exactly what you would think of when you think of the word structural. The first thing I did was lay out the challenge, lay out the reality to my administrative leadership team and to the college governance team, which in the world of higher education is framed within the name of shared governance. So it had representative faculty, professional, and support staff. So I started with them and then subsequently explained the whole thing to the college community at large. After considerable debate, and I do mean considerable debate, this college loved to debate, we vowed that together we were going to get through this. And we were going to go ahead and do what had never been done before at that institution. We were going to develop a plan for retrenchment. The plan, we agreed, would need to reflect the culture of the college, what we say we value, who we say we are. The structure for the development needed to reflect the college's belief in shared governance. And it included, as a part of it, because of that, what we came to call an ad hoc budget analysis committee. It came to be called affectionately the BAC, which basically had representatives from the faculty, the classified staff, and the administration. We told each other the truth above all else, which became a form of empowerment versus a sense of helplessness over the situation. I, as a leader, was exceptionally visible. I canceled everything that was out of the area. everything, and my job was to be at that college and to have a high visibility and a very high presence throughout the process. So, for me, the bottom line was that this human resource frame became an exceedingly important piece of the leadership process for developing this plan and riding the financial track of the institution. Third frame is political. You get the politics as well as I do. It recognizes that any issue has a political reality with different interest groups and different agendas. What my job was to plug into the institutional power bases, use that power carefully to promote a commonality of purpose so that the college became more than the sum of its constituencies on this issue. And the BAC, the Budget Analysis Committee, because it was so much in the muck of this with me, played an exceedingly important role relative to that. With this frame, I sought ownership in the plan and actions internally, and I sought to control the reactions to what we were doing externally. How? By meeting them head-on and anticipating the external pressures. For example, we were thinking about eliminating one of the healthcare programs. So I, on the front end, spent a lot of time with the local hospitals as well as the State Hospital Association. Used the BAC to pull together the classified staff, the faculty and the administrators, so that together we could move beyond personal agendas and do ultimately what was the right thing to do for the greater good. The individuals affected by this were informed the same day the college community was informed and the same day that the external community was informed through a media conference. Sequentially, all in one day. And I would guess you get the reason for that. We moved swiftly but deliberately, which brings me to the fourth frame, symbolic. This is the inspirational part. This is the part where an effective leader gives people something to